October 31st, 2019. Salem, Massachusetts. Dr. Margaret Blackwood had spent 7 years telling herself that vampires don't exist. The man in the black coat walked into a bookshop at exactly midnight. He placed a yellow document on her counter, a blood covenant written in medieval Latin. He introduced himself as Vladislav Dracul and extended his pale hand. Margaret refused to shake it. What happened in the next 60 seconds changed everything she believed about her daughter's death in Romania. The locals in Salem still whisper about that Halloween night. The FBI opened a cold case because of it. And for the past 4 years, when people ask Margaret Blackwood why she keeps silver bullets in her desk drawer, she always comes back to that moment. The moment she refused a vampire king's handshake. The moment she learned some family debts never die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the corner of Blackwood Antiquarian Books had just finished its midnight chime when Margaret noticed the temperature drop. Not the gentle autumn chill that seeped through Salem's old windows, but something else entirely, a cold that seemed to leach warmth from her very bones. The man standing across her mahogany counter didn't breathe. She'd been watching for 30 seconds now, counting the rise and fall of his chest that never came. His pale hand remained extended between them, perfectly still, as if carved from marble. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. "You misunderstand the gravity of your situation." Margaret's fingers found the silver letter opener beside her register, a habit she'd developed since Emma's disappearance. "I understand perfectly. You're either delusional or running some elaborate con, and either way you can take your medieval forgery and—" The lights went out, every street lamp on Chestnut Street, every jack-o'-lantern glowing in shop windows. Even the electric hum of her ancient refrigerator in the back room died to silence. The only illumination came from the man himself, a subtle luminescence that seemed to emanate from his skin. "The covenant is real, Margaret." He withdrew his hand and placed both palms flat on the document. Where his fingers touched the parchment, dark stains bloomed like spilled wine, as was your grandmother's signature. Margaret's throat constricted. She hadn't mentioned her grandmother to anyone in decades. Babushka Katerina had died when Margaret was 12, taking her strange bedtime stories about old country monsters to the grave. "That's impossible. My grandmother never—" December 15th, 1943. The village of Brasov. His eyes reflected the moonlight streaming through her shop window like a cat's. The SS had rounded up every man over 16. Your grandmother came to me in desperation, offering what she had left to trade. The silver letter opener trembled in Margaret's grip. "You're talking about 80 years ago. You'd have to be 147 years old, to be precise." He smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white, though I was born somewhat earlier than that. A memory surfaced unbidden. Emma, at 23, fresh out of graduate school, eyes blazing with academic fervor as she argued across this very counter. "Mom, you can't dismiss every folkloric account just because it challenges your materialist worldview. What if some of the old stories are true?" Margaret had laughed then, called her daughter naive, told her that critical thinking meant distinguishing between myth and reality. Emma had left for Romania 6 weeks later. What does any of this have to do with my daughter? The words came out hoarse, barely a whisper. Everything. Vladislav lifted one corner of the document, revealing Emma's handwriting underneath, notes scrawled in the margins, questions about bloodline inheritance and generational debt. "She found me, Margaret, just as you knew she would." The letter opener clattered to the floor. Margaret's legs gave out, and she collapsed into her desk chair, the worn leather creaking under her weight. 7 years of nightmares crashed over her, Romanian police reports she couldn't read, embassy officials with sympathetic eyes and no answers, the terrible certainty that she'd failed the only person who mattered. "Where is she? Safe?" His response came too quickly. "For now." That's not an answer. It's the only answer you'll receive until you fulfill your grandmother's obligation." He traced a finger along the covenant's edge, and the parchment began to glow with the same ethereal light. Katerina Blackwood bound her bloodline to mine in perpetuity. 1 generation to serve willingly given, in exchange for protection from forces far worse than the Nazis. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "I don't serve anyone." "Then perhaps we should discuss your granddaughter instead." The world tilted sideways. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles white against the cracked leather. "I don't have a granddaughter. Emma thought you should know." Vladislav reached into his coat and withdrew a photograph, a Polaroid with Emma's handwriting on the back. A dark-haired child, perhaps 5 years old, sitting in a garden somewhere with mountains in the distance. "Her name is Sophia. She has your eyes." Margaret's vision blurred. The bourbon she'd been nursing all evening rose bitter in her throat. Emma had been 29 when she disappeared. If she'd had a child, if there was a granddaughter Margaret had never met, never even known existed. "You're lying." "I never lie, Margaret. It's beneath my dignity." He slid the photograph across the counter. "The question now is whether you'll honor your grandmother's debt willingly, or whether I'll need to collect what's owed through alternative means." The lights flickered back to life, sudden and harsh after the supernatural darkness. Margaret blinked, momentarily blinded, and when her vision cleared, the man was gone. Only the covenant remained, Emma's notes still visible in the margins, and the photograph of a little girl who looked exactly like Emma had at that age. Margaret reached for the bourbon bottle with shaking hands. Outside, Salem's Halloween revelers stumbled past her window, drunk and laughing, blissfully unaware that monsters were real, and her family owed one of them a debt that spanned generations. The bourbon burned going down, but it couldn't chase away the chill that had settled into Margaret's bones. She sat alone in the harsh fluorescent aftermath of Vladislav's departure, the photograph of Sophia trembling between her fingers like a fallen leaf. The child's eyes were unmistakably Blackwood eyes, that peculiar shade of green that caught light like sea glass. Emma had inherited them from Margaret, who'd inherited them from Katerina. Now here was another generation Margaret had never known existed, staring back at her from a Polaroid with cracked edges and Emma's careful handwriting on the reverse, Sophia, age 5, September 2019. Margaret turned the photograph over. "Mom, if something happens to me, please find her. She's in Brasov with Anna. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. E." The words blurred as tears Margaret hadn't allowed herself to shed in 7 years finally came. She'd built walls around her grief, brick by brick, fortified them with academic skepticism and Jameson whiskey. But seeing her granddaughter's face, Emma's face at that age, cracked something fundamental inside her chest. The shop felt different now, smaller somehow. Shadows gathered in corners where they'd never lingered before, and every creak of the old building's bones made her flinch. The familiar sense of aged paper and leather binding that usually comforted her now seemed cloying, tinged with something metallic she couldn't identify. Margaret rose on unsteady legs and made her way to the back office, past towering shelves of folklore texts that had once been her armor against the supernatural. How many times had she stood before lecture halls, dismissing vampire legends as medieval metaphors for plague and political upheaval? How smugly she'd corrected students who confused myth with reality. Her grandmother's journal lay in the bottom drawer of her desk, wrapped in oiled cloth like a talisman. Margaret hadn't opened it since Emma's disappearance, couldn't bear to read Katerina's rambling accounts of old country spirits and bargains struck in blood. But now she unwrapped it with reverent fingers, searching for clues she'd been too rational to see before. The leather binding was soft with age, the pages filled with Katerina's spidery Cyrillic script interspersed with broken English. Margaret's Russian had grown rusty over the decades, but some passages leaped out with terrible clarity. The tall man came to me in the ruins of St. Nikolai Church. The SS had taken Mikhail and Pavel that morning. Little Anna hid in the cellar, weeping for her papa. I had nothing left to offer but my bloodline, and he accepted. Margaret's hand shook as she turned the page. He promised protection, yes, but not without price. One daughter from each generation to serve his house. I thought myself clever. I had no daughters then, only Anna would carry our name forward. I thought the debt would die with me, but Anna had been Margaret's mother, and Margaret had given birth to Emma, and Emma, somewhere in the mountains of Romania, had given birth to Sophia. The shop's front bell chimed, and Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. But it was only the wind, pushing through the door she'd forgotten to lock after Vladislav's departure. October air swirled through the aisles, scattering the loose papers on her counter and making the covenant rustle like whispered promises. She closed the door and turned the deadbolt, though she suspected such mundane barriers meant little to creatures that could extinguish streetlights with a thought. The Halloween decorations in her window, plastic skeletons and fabric ghosts, looked suddenly absurd. Children's toys in a world where real monsters wore expensive suits and spoke with old-world courtesy. Margaret poured another bourbon and settled back into her chair, studying the covenant by lamplight. Emma's annotations covered the margins in 3 different colored inks, evidence of multiple readings, careful analysis. Her daughter had been brilliant, fluent in 6 languages, with a PhD in Eastern European folklore from Harvard. If Emma had believed this document was genuine, if she'd traveled to Romania to investigate, the implications made Margaret's stomach clench. 7 years ago, she'd assumed Emma's disappearance was random tragedy. Wrong place, wrong time, a young American woman vanishing in the Carpathian wilderness. She'd never imagined her daughter had been following a trail that led straight back to their family's past. Her phone sat silent on the desk beside the register. She could call Detective Reyes in Boston, the kind Romanian liaison who'd helped coordinate the search efforts. She could reach out to the State Department, demand they reopen the case. But what would she tell them? That a vampire had visited her shop on Halloween night, claiming her daughter was alive but bound by supernatural contract? They'd think she'd finally snapped under the weight of her grief. Outside, Salem's Halloween celebration was winding down. The last groups of revelers stumbled past her window, their costumes disheveled, makeup smeared, voices raised in drunken song, normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that somewhere in Romania, a 5-year-old girl with Blackwood eyes was growing up without family, without protection, without knowing that her grandmother had spent 7 years believing her mother was dead. Margaret touched Sophia's photograph again, memorizing every detail of her granddaughter's face. Whatever price Vladislav demanded, whatever debt Katerina had incurred in her desperation, the calculation was simple now. Family was all that mattered. Everything else was just words on old paper. Margaret was reaching for the phone to call Detective Reyes when it rang, the shrill tone cutting through the shop's silence like a blade. She jerked back, bourbon sloshing over the rim of her glass, and stared at the device as if it might bite her. The caller ID showed only numbers, an international prefix she didn't recognize. Romania. The phone rang again, insistent, and Margaret's pulse hammered in her throat. 3 rings, 4. On the 5th, she lifted the receiver with trembling fingers. Hello? Her voice came out as a whisper. Static crackled across the connection, then cleared to reveal labored breathing. A woman's voice, weak but unmistakably familiar, spoke from across an ocean. Mom? The receiver slipped from Margaret's grasp, clattering against the desk. Emma. After 7 years of silence, 7 years of believing her daughter was dead, Emma's voice filtered through the static like a ghost made flesh. Margaret scrambled to retrieve the phone. Emma? Emma? Where are you? Are you? Mom, listen carefully. Emma's voice was strained, urgent. I don't have long. He's allowing this call because you met with him tonight. Margaret's free hand clutched Sophia's photograph against her chest. The vampire. Vladislav. He showed me a picture of Sophia. Yes. A sound that might have been a sob carried across the connection. Mom, she's beautiful. She's so smart and she asks about you constantly. I've told her stories about her grandmother who owns a magic bookshop in America. Tears streamed down Margaret's face unchecked. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call? I thought you were dead. I couldn't. Emma's voice broke. The covenant binds more than just service, Mom. It binds silence. I've been trying to reach you for 7 years, but every time I tried to call, to write, the words would disappear. He controls what we can say, when we can say it. Margaret sank deeper into her chair, the weight of revelation crushing her chest. 7 years of imagining Emma dead in some Romanian ravine when her daughter had been alive, trapped, trying desperately to make contact. The debt, real. Emma's confirmation came swift and bitter. Great-grandmother's signature is genuine. I came here to disprove it, to write a paper debunking the whole thing. Instead, I walked straight into his domain and activated a contract I didn't understand. Static surged across the line, and Emma's voice faded before returning stronger. Mom, you have to listen. There are things about our family I never knew, things Babushka never told us. The Blackwood women aren't just bound to serve him. We're connected to something older, something that goes back centuries before Katerina ever set foot in Romania. Margaret fumbled for her grandmother's journal, pages rustling as she searched for passages she'd dismissed as folklore. What are you talking about? The bloodline isn't just payment for his protection. It's a key. We carry something in our blood that he needs, something that makes us valuable beyond simple servitude. Emma's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. He's not just holding Sophia and me prisoner. He's studying us, trying to understand what makes Blackwood blood special. A new chill settled over Margaret, deeper than the supernatural cold Vladislav had brought to her shop. Studying you how? Blood samples. Genetic testing. He has equipment here that doesn't belong in a medieval castle, Mom. Modern machines, computers, medical devices. He's not some ancient monster clinging to old ways. He's adapting, evolving, and he thinks our bloodline is the key to something bigger. The phone line crackled with interference, and Emma's voice became urgent. Mom, he's coming back. I have maybe 30 seconds. Listen to me. Don't honor the debt, not yet. There's something hidden in Babushka's belongings, something she kept secret even from the family. A second document, older than the covenant. Find it first. Learn what she really traded away before you... The line went dead. Margaret stared at the silent receiver, her daughter's final words echoing in the sudden quiet. A second document, something Katerina had hidden, kept secret even from her own family. Margaret rose on unsteady legs and looked around her shop with new eyes, seeing not just the comfortable refuge she'd built after Emma's disappearance, but a repository of family secrets she'd never thought to explore. Her grandmother's effects filled 3 trunks in the basement storage room, belongings Margaret had inherited but never properly sorted through. She'd always assumed they contained nothing but old photographs and Katerina's collection of religious icons. But if Emma was right, if there was something else hidden among those carefully preserved memories... Margaret grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement stairs. The bourbon still burned in her veins, but her mind felt crystal clear for the first time in years. Her daughter was alive. A granddaughter needed her. And somewhere in the darkness below, the truth about the Blackwood bloodline waited to be unearthed. The old wooden steps creaked under her weight as she descended into the shadows, leaving the safety of her shop behind forever. The basement smelled of dust and abandonment, thick with the weight of 7 years' neglect. Margaret's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing towers of cardboard boxes and forgotten inventory stacked against stone walls that predated Salem's tourist renaissance. In the far corner, where she'd banished them after the funeral 15 years ago, sat Katerina's 3 trunks like sleeping sentinels. The first trunk yielded exactly what Margaret expected: yellowed photographs of relatives whose names she'd never learned, orthodox prayer books with cracked spines, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows as Margaret lifted each item, searching for something she couldn't name. The flashlight flickered, and she cursed her procrastination. When had she last changed these batteries? The second trunk held clothing that still carried traces of Katerina's rosewater perfume, making Margaret's throat constrict with unexpected grief. Beneath layers of silk scarves and hand-embroidered blouses, her fingers found something hard, a small wooden box wrapped in black cloth, the kind of thing that demanded careful handling. Margaret unwrapped it with trembling fingers. The box was older than anything else she'd found, its surface carved with symbols that predated Christianity. Orthodox crosses were etched over them, as if someone had tried to sanctify whatever lay beneath. The lid resisted her attempts to open it, warped with age and sealed with what looked like red wax. She was picking at the seal when footsteps echoed from the shop above. Margaret froze, flashlight beam wavering against the basement ceiling. The shop was locked, she was certain of that. But the footsteps continued, not the heavy tread of boots, but soft, deliberate movement across her wooden floors. Another set joined the first, then a third. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps as she clicked off the flashlight, plunging herself into absolute darkness. The box pressed against her chest as she crouched behind her grandmother's trunks, listening to the sounds of invasion above. Whoever was up there moved with purpose, opening drawers, shifting papers, searching for something. A woman's voice drifted down through the floorboards, speaking in what sounded like Romanian. The tone was urgent, frightened. Another voice answered, male, equally tense. They knew about the basement, about the trunks, about her. Margaret's phone had no signal in the basement, its screen showing nothing but empty bars when she cupped it to shield the glow. The stairs creaked. Someone was coming down. She scrambled deeper into the shadows, clutching the wooden box against her ribs. The basement had no other exit. She'd checked when she first bought the building, annoyed by the fire code violations. Now that oversight might cost her everything. A flashlight beam swept across the basement floor, much brighter than her failing device. The light moved systematically, professionally, searching corners and checking behind storage boxes. Margaret pressed herself against the stone wall, trying to become invisible, trying not to breathe. "Nu este aici," the woman's voice said, closer now. "Not here." "Trebui să fie undeva," came the man's response. It must be somewhere. Margaret didn't speak Romanian, but their tone needed no translation. They were looking for the same thing she was, whatever Katerina had hidden among her belongings. The flashlight beam swept closer to her hiding spot, and Margaret realized with cold certainty that discovery was inevitable. The wooden box grew warm against her chest, or perhaps that was just her racing pulse. As the searchers moved closer, symbols carved into its surface began to glow with the same ethereal light she'd seen in Vladislav's document. The light was faint, barely visible, but in the absolute darkness of the basement, it might as well have been a beacon. Margaret clamped her hands over the box, trying to smother the glow, but light leaked between her fingers like captured starlight. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched across the basement, broken only by the sound of her own terrified breathing. "Acolo," the woman whispered. "There." Margaret broke from cover, stumbling through the maze of storage boxes toward the stairs. The flashlight beam found her immediately, and shouts erupted behind her. She heard boxes crashing, footsteps pounding across concrete, but her focus narrowed to the wooden steps and the door to her shop above. She burst through the basement door and slammed it behind her, throwing the deadbolt with shaking hands. The intruders hammered against the wood, voices raised in urgent Romanian. The door shuddered under their assault, but it held. For now, Margaret ran for the front of the shop, clutching the glowing box against her chest. She needed to get out, needed to find somewhere safe to examine what she'd found. But as she reached for the front door, a familiar figure stepped from the shadows between her bookcases. Vladislav stood waiting, his pale hands folded patiently before him. Behind him, two more figures emerged from the darkness, a young woman with hollow eyes and an older man whose left hand bore fresh bandages. "Good evening, Margaret," Vladislav said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "I see you found Katerina's final secret." The glowing box burned against Margaret's ribs like a living coal as she faced Vladislav across her ravaged shop. Behind her, the basement door groaned under the assault of his servants, each impact sending vibrations through the floorboards. There was nowhere left to run. "Your people destroyed my store," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The bourbon still hummed in her veins, dulling the sharp edge of terror. "My people?" Vladislav tilted his head with practiced curiosity. "Those are not my servants, Margaret. They belong to someone far less patient than I." His pale eyes fixed on the box she clutched. "Someone who has been searching for that artifact much longer than you might imagine." The basement door splintered. Wood cracked, and the deadbolt shrieked against its housing. Margaret pressed her back against the wall between her folklore section and the romance novels, feeling absurdly grateful that Emma had never lived to see her life's work reduced to this supernatural farce. "What is it?" she whispered, looking down at the box. The carved symbols pulsed brighter now, responding to some proximity she didn't understand. "What did my grandmother hide?" "The original contract," said the hollow-eyed woman beside Vladislav. Her accent was thicker than his, rougher. "Not the paper your babushka signed in 1943, but the document that made such bargains possible in the first place." Margaret's breath caught. "Emma, I am Ileana," the woman said, and Margaret's heart shattered as she recognized the lie. This creature wore her daughter's face, but the eyes were wrong, ancient, hungry, carrying centuries of pain that Emma had never known. "Though I have been studying your daughter's memories with great interest." The basement door exploded inward. Two figures stumbled through, a woman in tactical gear, and a man whose bandaged hand left bloody prints on everything he touched. They spoke rapidly in Romanian, gesturing toward Margaret and the glowing box with obvious desperation. Vladislav sighed. Hunters. How tedious. He spoke to them in their own language, his tone carrying absolute authority. The woman shook her head violently, raising some kind of modified crossbow. The man pulled a silver blade from his coat. "They believe you can destroy the Covenant," Vladislav explained to Margaret, switching back to English. "Break the supernatural bonds that have kept your bloodline in service for generations." They are, unfortunately, quite correct. Margaret's grip tightened on the box. "Then why don't you just take it from me?" "Because the artifact chooses its wielder. It responds only to Blackwood blood, and only when that blood is freely given." His smile was winter incarnate. "Your grandmother understood this when she hid it away. She could have used it to break her own contract, but doing so would have voided the protection she'd purchased. The SS would have returned to finish what they started." The female hunter shouted something urgent, raising her crossbow toward Vladislav. He moved faster than Margaret's eyes could follow, crossing the space between them like mist made solid. The weapon flew from the woman's hands, and she crumpled to the floor with her neck twisted at an impossible angle. The man with a bandaged hand lunged toward Margaret, silver blade gleaming. She threw herself sideways, crashing into a display of children's fairy tales. Books scattered everywhere. Grimm's original collections, unexpurgated Anderson. Stories where children learned that monsters were real and happy endings cost more than most people could afford to pay. Vladislav caught the hunter's wrist before the blade could find its mark. Margaret heard bones snap like kindling. The silver clattered across her floor, coming to rest beside a volume of Romanian folktales that Emma had sent her years ago. "The choice is yours, Margaret," Vladislav said, stepping over the hunter's motionless form. "Honor your grandmother's debt, and I will return your daughter to you. Use that box to break the covenant, and Emma dies screaming while little Sophia learns what happens to granddaughters who inherit broken promises." Margaret struggled to her feet, the box's glow painting everything in spectral light. The symbols carved into its surface were moving now, shifting like living things desperate to escape their wooden prison. She could feel something vast and ancient pressing against her consciousness, not Vladislav's supernatural presence, but something older, hungrier, infinitely more patient. "There's a third option, isn't there?" she said, pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. "Something you haven't told me." Vladislav's expression shifted, revealing the first crack in his composed facade she'd seen. Behind him, the creature wearing Emma's face smiled with anticipation that belonged to neither daughter nor monster. "Tell me about the original contract," Margaret demanded, raising the box between them like a weapon. "Tell me what the Blackwood women really are, or I'll break this thing right now and damn the consequences." The shop fell silent except for the whisper of settling debris. Outside, Salem's Halloween night continued its cheerful debauchery, but inside her ruined sanctuary, Margaret Blackwood prepared to learn truths that would make the Covenant seem like mercy. The wooden box pulsed against Margaret's palms like a dying heartbeat as Vladislav's mask of aristocratic composure finally cracked. For 7 centuries he had been the apex predator, the ancient king who commanded from shadows. Now, faced with a grandmother's desperate fury, something almost human flickered behind his pale eyes. "You want the truth?" His voice carried a tremor Margaret had never heard before. "Your bloodline isn't bound to serve me, Margaret. It's bound to contain me." The words hit her like a physical blow. Margaret's grip on the box tightened as fragments of memory realigned themselves. Her grandmother's nervous habits around religious symbols, the way Katerina had always worn iron jewelry, the Orthodox crosses carved over older symbols in their family Bible. Not protection from evil, but protection from something specific. The original contract wasn't signed by a Blackwood seeking aid, Vladislav continued, his composure crumbling like ancient parchment. It was signed by something far older than me, something that required a bloodline to serve as its prison wardens. Your ancestors didn't bargain with me. They were recruited to keep me caged. The creature wearing Emma's face stepped forward, and Margaret finally saw what she'd missed before. The hollow eyes, the ancient hunger, the way it moved like a puppet with half its strings cut. This wasn't some supernatural servant studying her daughter's memories. This was Emma herself, but wrong, fundamentally altered by something that had nothing to do with vampiric transformation. "My God," Margaret whispered. "What did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything," Vladislav snarled, and for the first time Margaret heard genuine pain in his voice. "She did it to herself. Your brilliant daughter found the castle's real secrets, the ones I've spent centuries trying to forget. She opened doors that should have remained sealed and woke something that makes my nature seem positively benign by comparison." Margaret's academic mind raced through the implications, connecting dots she'd been too traumatized to see. Emma's sudden departure for Romania, her secretive research into bloodline magic, the way her letters had stopped not when she'd disappeared, but weeks before, right around the time she would have reached Vladislav's domain. "The phone calls," Margaret said, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "When she called me, when she warned me about a second document, that wasn't really Emma, was it?" Vladislav's silence was answer enough. The creature that had worn her daughter's voice smiled with Emma's mouth, but the expression belonged to something that had never been human. "You've been feeding it," Margaret continued, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "Every time you sent one of my family members to you, you weren't adding to your power. You were feeding whatever's wearing my daughter like a costume. The entity requires Blackwood blood to maintain its hold on your daughter's form," Vladislav admitted. "Each generation that serves strengthens its anchor to this reality. Your grandmother understood this when she signed her covenant. She wasn't trading her bloodline's service to save her village. She was ensuring the entity remained bound to me, rather than free to hunt on its own." Margaret looked at the glowing box in her hands with new horror. "This isn't a tool to break the covenant, it's a key. To unlock what should never be released," Vladislav confirmed. "Your grandmother hid it because she knew that someday her descendants might discover the truth and attempt to free themselves. The box contains the original binding, the real contract that keeps the entity contained within the confines of my domain. Break that, and it won't need Emma's body anymore. It will be free to wear anyone's face, to hunt anywhere it chooses." The shop suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as Margaret grasped the true scope of her grandmother's sacrifice. Katerina hadn't sold her family into supernatural slavery. She'd volunteered them as guards for a prison they could never escape, protecting the world from something far worse than vampires. But there's another option, Margaret said, the words forming before she fully understood them. You're afraid of it too. That's why you've been so careful. Why you've maintained the pretense of being in control. You need the Blackwood bloodline as much as it does, but for different reasons. Vladislav's aristocratic facade shattered completely. It grows stronger with each generation. Soon my bindings won't be enough to contain it. I need someone with Blackwood blood to strengthen the prison from the inside, to become part of the binding itself. Sophia, Margaret breathed. She's the strongest of your line I've ever encountered. With her power anchoring the original binding, the entity could be contained for another 1,000 years. His pale eyes met hers, but only if she chooses to take on that burden willingly. Margaret stared at the box, understanding finally why her grandmother had hidden it away. Not to protect the Blackwood women from their debt, but to ensure they never had to choose between their freedom and the world's safety. The entity wearing Emma's face stepped closer, hungry anticipation radiating from every stolen feature. Choose quickly, grandmother, it said with Emma's voice. Dawn approaches and some doors can only be opened in darkness. Margaret's hands trembled around the wooden box as Emma's stolen voice echoed through her destroyed shop. Dawn. She could see the first pale threads of morning light creeping beneath her boarded windows, and suddenly understood why Vladislav had waited until Halloween night for this confrontation. Not for theatrical effect, but because whatever ancient binding held the entity required darkness to be manipulated. "How long do I have?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Minutes," Vladislav replied, glancing toward the windows with genuine anxiety. The original contract specifies that any alterations to the binding must be completed before sunrise. After that, the terms lock for another year. Margaret's academic mind seized on the detail, even as her heart shattered. That's why Emma disappeared on October 31st, 7 years ago. She found this same choice, didn't she? The entity wearing her daughter's face tilted its head with predatory interest. Your daughter was resourceful. She discovered the binding chamber beneath my castle and attempted to break the covenant entirely. The result, as you can see, was less than successful. Emma tried to free us all, Margaret breathed, understanding flooding through her. She thought she was breaking a contract of servitude, but instead she weakened the prison walls, and provided me with such an excellent new form. The entity purred with Emma's voice. Though I confess her memories of you have been quite illuminating. Such guilt you carry, Margaret, such exquisite maternal failure. White-hot rage blazed through Margaret's chest, burning away 7 years of self-recrimination. Don't you dare speak to me with her voice about guilt. I know what you are now, what you've always been. A parasite that feeds on bloodline magic and family bonds. She turned to face Vladislav directly, the box pulsing brighter as dawn approached. You said Sophia is the strongest of our line. That means she's stronger than Emma was, stronger than my grandmother. What exactly makes Blackwood blood so special to this thing? Vladislav's expression grew pained. Your family line carries a genetic anomaly that allows you to perceive and manipulate supernatural bindings. It's exceptionally rare. Perhaps one bloodline in 10,000 carries the trait. The entity requires that specific ability to anchor itself to our reality. But Sophia doesn't know, does she? Margaret pressed. She has no idea what she is, what she can do. That's why you need her to choose willingly. The power only works if she understands and accepts it. The child shows signs of manifesting the ability early, Vladislav admitted. Far earlier than previous generations. If properly trained, she could become a binding anchor strong enough to contain the entity permanently. But if she remains untrained and the entity breaks free, he didn't need to finish. Margaret could see the implications clearly enough. An entity that fed on family bonds, loose in a world full of bloodline connections, wearing the faces of loved ones to hunt. It would spread like a plague across every family line until nothing human remained. The eastern horizon was lightening faster now. Margaret could feel time running out like sand through her fingers, and with it, any chance of saving both her granddaughter and her daughter. The wooden box grew almost too hot to hold, its carved symbols writhing frantically as if they could sense the approaching deadline. "There's something you're not telling me," she said, studying Vladislav's increasingly desperate expression. "Something about the binding that changes everything." The Vampire King's composure finally cracked entirely. The anchor must be willing, yes, but the binding requires a blood sacrifice to seal it, not death, something far worse. The anchor becomes part of the prison itself, conscious but trapped, aware but powerless, for as long as the entity exists. Margaret's breath caught as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My grandmother knew. When she signed the covenant in 1943, she wasn't just offering our service. She was ensuring that when the time came, one of her descendants would have to make that sacrifice. Katerina was remarkably prescient, Vladislav admitted. She understood that the entity would eventually require a permanent anchor, and she prepared your bloodline for that eventuality. The entity stepped closer, Emma's face alight with malicious joy. "Such a delicious choice, grandmother. Sacrifice yourself to save little Sophia and condemn her to a lifetime of hunting other bloodlines for my entertainment. Sacrifice the child to save yourself and watch the world burn with her power fueling my freedom." Margaret looked down at the glowing box, then at the creature wearing her daughter's stolen face, then finally at Vladislav's ancient, desperate eyes. Dawn was perhaps 5 minutes away. After that, the choice would be made for her, by time, by circumstance, by the grinding inevitability of supernatural law. But Margaret Blackwood had spent 40 years studying folklore and mythology. She knew that ancient contracts always contained loopholes, and that the most binding agreements often concealed their own destruction within their terms. She smiled grimly, and began working at the box's sealed lid with her fingernails. "Tell me, Vladislav," she said conversationally, "what happens to binding anchors when there's nothing left to bind?" Vladislav's ancient eyes widened as Margaret's question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. For the first time in 7 centuries, the Vampire King looked genuinely terrified. Margaret, no, but she had already pried the wooden lid open. The box erupted with light that had nothing to do with dawn. Ancient symbols blazed from the parchment within, words written in languages that predated human civilization. Margaret felt the power coursing through her Blackwood blood, recognizing the binding for what it truly was. Not just a prison, but a parasitic contract that had been feeding on her family's essence for generations. "You brilliant, ruthless woman," she whispered, understanding her grandmother's final gambit. "You didn't just hide this to protect us. You left us the tools to destroy the binding entirely." The entity wearing Emma's face shrieked, a sound that shattered every remaining window in the shop. "You cannot. The contract is eternal. The bloodline is bound." "No," Margaret said, her voice steady as she began tearing the ancient parchment. "The contract binds the entity to our bloodline, yes, but it also means that if the Blackwood line chooses extinction over servitude, the binding fails completely." Vladislav lunged toward her with supernatural speed, but Margaret had spent 7 years planning for this moment without knowing it. Every night of bourbon-soaked research, every obsessive study of bloodline magic and binding contracts had prepared her for this single act of maternal defiance. The parchment burned in her hands, but not from flame, from the sheer force of centuries-old magic being violently severed. Margaret felt her grandmother's essence within the binding, and her great-grandmother's, and countless Blackwood women stretching back to whatever desperate ancestor had first made this devil's bargain. They had all known this day would come. They had all prepared for one of their daughters to make the final choice. "Emma!" Margaret called to the creature writhing in supernatural agony as its anchor to reality began dissolving. "I know you're in there. I know you can hear me." For just a moment the ancient hunger left her daughter's eyes. Emma's true self surfaced, confused and terrified, but blessedly, recognizably human. "Mom?" Emma's voice was small, lost, exactly as it had been when she was 7 and woke from nightmares. "I'm sorry. I tried to save everyone, but I made it worse. I made everything worse." "No, sweetheart." Margaret continued tearing the parchment as dawn light flooded through the broken windows. "You found the truth. You showed me what needed to be done. You saved us all." The entity reasserted control, Emma's features twisting with malevolent rage. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal. I am dependent on a contract that no longer exists," Margaret finished, shredding the final corner of the parchment. The effect was immediate and devastating. The entity's form began unraveling, losing cohesion as the binding that had tethered it to Emma's stolen body dissolved. For a terrifying moment, Margaret saw what it truly was, not some ancient demon or primordial evil, but something far worse. A void in the shape of hunger, a cosmic absence that had learned to wear love as a disguise. Vladislav collapsed to his knees as the binding's destruction severed his connection to the entity as well. 7 centuries of unwilling partnership ended in an instant, leaving him looking suddenly profoundly mortal. "The bloodline," he gasped. "By destroying the contract, you've severed your family's supernatural potential entirely. Sophia will never manifest the ability. She'll never be at risk." "That's the point," Margaret said, watching Emma's body flicker between possession and freedom as the entity's hold weakened. "Some gifts are too dangerous to accept." The shop filled with otherworldly wind as reality itself recoiled from the binding's violent termination. Books flew from their shelves and the very air seemed to scream. But through it all, Margaret held her ground, watching her daughter fight for control of her own flesh. Emma won. The entity's final shriek cut off abruptly as it lost corporeal form entirely. Without the Blackwood bloodline to anchor it, without a willing host to inhabit, it simply ceased. Not destroyed, perhaps, but cast back into whatever void it had originally emerged from, no longer able to touch the human world. Emma collapsed, her body suddenly, completely her own again. Margaret rushed to her daughter's side, pulling her into an embrace that 7 years of guilt and grief poured into. Emma was older, marked by supernatural trauma that would take years to heal, but alive, human, free. "The choice," Emma whispered against her mother's shoulder. "I thought I had to choose between the family's freedom and everyone else's safety. I never realized there was a third option." "There's always a third option," Margaret murmured, stroking her daughter's hair as Salem's Halloween dawn painted her ruined shop in shades of gold and possibility. "Sometimes it just costs everything you thought you couldn't afford to lose." Behind them, Vladislav struggled to his feet, looking lost without the supernatural bonds that had defined his existence for centuries. Outside, Sophia would wake to an ordinary world, never knowing how close she had come to inheriting a terrible destiny. The Blackwood women were finally, truly free. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of her rebuilt shop, watching snowflakes drift past windows that would never again need to be boarded against supernatural threats. The insurance adjuster had attributed the Halloween destruction to atmospheric pressure differential caused by the nor'easter, an explanation Margaret found infinitely preferable to the truth. The new shelves held fewer rare manuscripts and more contemporary works, travel guides, romance novels, children's picture books. Ordinary books for ordinary people living ordinary lives. Margaret had discovered she preferred it that way. Emma sat behind the counter, her hair shorter now, silver threading through the auburn in ways that made her look older than 32. She tired easily, and sometimes Margaret caught her staring at nothing with haunted eyes, but she was healing. They both were. "Another package from Sophia," Emma said, holding up a manila envelope decorated with a 10-year-old's enthusiastic artwork. "She wants to know if we're coming for Christmas." Margaret smiled, though it carried the weight of careful distance. They'd told Sophia's parents that Emma had been found suffering from amnesia after a hiking accident in Romania, a partial truth that explained the gaps without mentioning ancient contracts or cosmic entities. Sophia herself remained blissfully unaware that she'd once been destined for anything more dramatic than elementary school spelling tests. "We should go," Margaret said, though part of her still feared proximity to her granddaughter. The supernatural potential was gone. She was certain of that. But 7 years of terror didn't fade easily. She deserves to know her aunt. Emma nodded, then hesitated. "I've been thinking about what comes next, after I'm steadier. I can't go back to folklore research, but maybe something related. Art therapy, perhaps. Helping other people process trauma." "That sounds perfect," Margaret said, and meant it. Emma had always been drawn to healing, even before the entity had twisted that impulse into supernatural obligation. Some essential truths survived even the worst violations. The bell above the door chimed, and Vladislav entered, stamping snow from expensive boots that looked absurdly out of place in Salem's casual winter atmosphere. He'd adapted to mortality with surprising grace, though he still moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to supernatural strength he no longer possessed. "Ladies," he nodded formally, setting a wrapped package on the counter. A small Christmas gift. First editions of Stoker, though I suspect you'll find them less accurate than expected. Margaret unwrapped the books with genuine curiosity. Vladislav had become an unexpected ally in the aftermath, helping them understand the supernatural world they'd left behind while building a decidedly mundane new life. He'd taken a position teaching European history at a small college in Vermont, where his centuries of first-hand experience made him an excellent lecturer on medieval politics. "Any word from the others?" Emma asked quietly. Vladislav's expression darkened slightly. "The supernatural community is adjusting. Your grandmother's binding was older and more extensive than we initially realized. Several other entities lost their anchors when you destroyed it. Most have retreated to whatever realms they originated from, but a few are attempting to establish new footholds. Our problem?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not unless you choose to make it so. The Blackwood bloodline's connection to that world is permanently severed. You're as invisible to supernatural forces as any other human family." Margaret felt the familiar mixture of relief and loss that had defined these past months. They were free, but freedom had required sacrificing something that had defined her family for generations. Sometimes, lying awake at 3 a.m, she wondered if they'd given up too much. Then she remembered the entity wearing Emma's face, and knew they'd made the only choice possible. "There's something else," Vladislav continued, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been researching other families with similar obligations. If you ever decided to help them, your experience with binding contracts would be invaluable." Emma and Margaret exchanged glances. They'd discussed this possibility during the long nights of recovery, the question of whether their hard-won knowledge carried its own responsibility. "Ask me again in a year," Margaret said finally, "when we've both learned how to live ordinary lives." Vladislav nodded and took his leave, disappearing into the snow like the anachronism he'd become. Margaret locked the door behind him and flipped the sign to closed, then returned to the counter where Emma was reading one of Sophia's cheerful letters aloud. Outside, Salem settled into the quiet rhythm of a winter evening. No ancient entities stirred in the gathering darkness. No supernatural obligations tugged at their bloodline. No terrible choices loomed on the horizon. For the first time in 7 years, Margaret Blackwood fell asleep without bourbon, without guilt, without the weight of inherited destiny pressing against her dreams. Some stories ended not with grand revelation or cosmic justice, but with the simple, precious gift of choosing your own tomorrow. And sometimes that was enough.